Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Oh, yeah.
We're diving deep
That's fun.
into René Girard's Violence and the Sacred.
Oh, this is a good one.
It's
Yeah.
it's a challenging read,
Yeah.
but it really changes how you see the world
Hmm.
once you understand what he's getting at.
I agree. It's one of those books that makes you rethink, well, everything really, from ancient myths to modern politics. I mean, Girard's basic idea is that violence is at the heart of human society, not just as a destructive force, but as a fundamental element in how we create order and meaning.
Okay, so let's give our listener a bit of a roadmap here. What are the big ideas they should be looking out for as we go through this?
Well, the core concept is the scapegoat mechanism. Societies use sacrifice to channel collective violence onto a single victim, creating a sense of unity and purging themselves of their own violent tendencies. But it goes deeper than that. Girard explores how this plays out in mythology, religion, ritual, even our modern justice systems. He also digs into things like mimetic desire, the idea that we often want things simply because other people want them, which creates rivalry and conflict. And he ties it all together with this fascinating analysis of how societies deal with the crisis of distinctions, those moments when the boundaries that hold everything together start to break down.
Right, so we're not just talking about ancient rituals here, although we'll definitely get into those. This is about understanding the hidden patterns of violence. That might still be at work in our lives today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to do that, we need to start with the foundation of Girard's argument, the scapegoat mechanism. It's this idea that societies, especially in the absence of a formal justice system, are constantly at risk of falling into cycles of revenge.
Right, like that eye for an eye kind of thing.
Exactly. And Girard argues that sacrifice, whether it's a ritual killing or the exile of a single person, acts as a kind of circuit breaker. It focuses all that diffuse violence onto a single acceptable target.
And that breaks the cycle, because everyone can agree that this person, this scapegoat, deserves what they get.
Precisely. And Girard uses some powerful examples from the Bible to illustrate this. Think about the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob tricks his father into giving him the blessing meant for his brother, essentially making Esau a scapegoat.
It's almost like a transfer of violence, right? Esau loses his birthright, but the family avoids a potential blood feud.
Exactly. And Girard argues that this same logic is at work. In countless myths and rituals across cultures, he points to Greek tragedies like Medea, where we see similar patterns of scapegoating and the displacement of violence. One of his most famous passages, talking about the arbitrary nature of the victim, comes up here. He says, "The victim is arbitrary, but the accusation is not."
Meaning, it doesn't really matter who the scapegoat is, as long as there's someone to take on that role, to embody the violence and allow everyone else to feel innocent.
Exactly. And this is where things start to get really interesting, because Girard suggests that this need to find a scapegoat, to create a sense of unity through exclusion, might be more deeply ingrained in human nature than we'd like to admit.
So it's not just about jars,
Yeah.
those ancient societies, with their animal sacrifices and ritual killings.
Right. Girard argues that even our modern justice systems, with all their laws and procedures, might be rooted in this ancient need to channel violence, to find someone to blame. It's a much more civilized form of scapegoating. But the underlying logic is strikingly similar.
So even when we think we're being rational and objective, we might still be driven by these primal impulses.
That's the implication. And Girard challenges us to look for these patterns, not just in ancient myths, but in our own lives and societies.
Okay, so we've got the scapegoat mechanism as the foundation. What's the next layer of this?
Girard connects this idea of the scapegoat to the concept of ritual impurity, things like blood, disease, or even certain social transgressions.
Right, like those ancient taboos, don't touch the dead body, don't sleep with your sister, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And Girard argues that these taboos are about more than just hygiene or morality. They're about the fear of contagious violence. He says these things are seen as polluting because they're associated with chaos, with the potential for violence to spread uncontrollably.
So it's like they're trying to create a kind of cordon sanitaire around these dangerous elements to prevent the infection from spreading.
That's a good analogy. And Girard uses the example of the Dinka people in South Sudan. They have these elaborate rituals surrounding sacrifice, including ritualistic curses directed at the animal.
What's the purpose of those curses?
Yeah.
Is it just to add insult to injury?
Girard suggests that it's about symbolically transferring the community's violence and anxieties onto the victim. They're almost trying to magically contain the potential for chaos through these verbal pronouncements.
So it's like they're loading up the scapegoat with all their negative energy, their fear, their aggression, hoping to cleanse themselves in the process.
That's a powerful way to put it. And it highlights how these seemingly irrational rituals are actually performing a very important social function. They're helping to maintain order, to prevent the community from tearing itself apart.
Okay, this is getting our listener a lot to think about, but where does the idea of a crisis come into all of this? You mentioned earlier that Girard talks about a crisis of distinctions.
Right. This is one of Girard's most crucial concepts, and it's tied to everything we've discussed so far. He argues that societies are always at risk of what he calls a sacrificial crisis. This happens when the distinctions that hold society together, social hierarchies, cultural norms, even basic differences between people, start to blur.
So it's like
Yeah,
everyone's losing their place in the world, and that creates a breeding ground for violence.
exactly. When those distinctions collapse, violence becomes rampant. Because the rules are no longer clear, people don't know where they stand, who's in charge, what's right and wrong.
It's like that saying, hell is other people, but taken to a whole new level.
And Girard uses some pretty stark examples to illustrate this. He talks about the king game of Brazil, who had a culture of constant blood feuds and lacked a complex mythology. He suggests that their society exemplifies this breakdown of distinctions, leading to a perpetual cycle of revenge.
Like they were trapped in this never-ending cycle of violence, because there was nothing to braid it. No clear boundaries, no sense of order.
And Girard contrasts this with societies that have developed strong myths and rituals around sacrifice. He argues that these cultural narratives provide a way to channel violence, to create a sense of order out of chaos.
So those myths aren't just stories. They're actually serving a vital social function. They're helping to prevent the whole system from imploding.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful examples Girard uses is the myth of Oedipus.
Oedipus. Talk about a messed up family drama. But how does he fit into this whole idea of the sacrificial crisis?
For Girard, Oedipus is the ultimate scapegoat. He embodies the crisis of distinctions, unknowingly killing his father and marrying his mother. But through his suffering, he ultimately brings about a kind of resolution, a restoration of order.
So he's both, the source of the pollution and the solution. That seems like a pretty important theme for our listener to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And this duality, the polluted sacred, is at the heart of the scapegoat mechanism. Oedipus is both a criminal and a savior, a source of horror and a source of redemption. By transferring all the blame onto him, the society can maintain its illusion of innocence and restore a sense of order.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. We've got the scapegoat mechanism, the fear of contagious violence, the crisis of distinctions, and this idea of the polluted sacred. Where do we go from here?
Well, now that we've laid the foundation, I think it's time to explore how these ideas play out in some of Girard's more controversial analyses, starting with his interpretation of royal incest.
All right, this should get interesting. Incest is a pretty taboo subject, even today. How does Girard approach it?
He sees it not as a perverse act, but as another form of embodying the polluted sacred, the king who often occupies a precarious position between order and chaos, takes on the burden of transgression, drawing violence onto himself to protect the community.
Okay, we're going to need to unpack that one a bit more. Let's pick up there after a quick break. Stay with us, listeners, as we continue our deep dive into violence and the sacred.
So to understand Girard's take on royal incest, you have to see it through the lens of sacrifice. It's not about personal desire or morality in the conventional sense, but about the king embodying this polluted sacred to maintain order.
So the king is deliberately breaking the biggest taboo, but for the good of the community. That's a tough one to wrap your head around.
It is. And Girard uses some pretty compelling examples, like the Mossis people of Burkina Faso. Their enthronement ceremony involves the new king committing a series of transgressions, including incest as part of taking power.
It's like they're forcing him to become contaminated, to absorb all that potential chaos into himself.
That's one way to look at it. And remember, for Girard, the king represents both order and transgression. He's this lightning rod for the community's anxieties, but he's also the symbol of their unity.
So it's almost like he's walking a tightrope, right? Too much transgression and the whole system falls apart. But without that element of danger of the polluted sacred, he can't really hold that power.
Exactly. And you can see this same dynamic at work in societies where the king is ritually sacrificed.
Oh, wow. Yeah, like the king takes on all the community's sins and then they eliminate him to purify themselves. Talk about a high-stakes job.
It's the ultimate expression of the scapegoat mechanism for Girard. But the point is, this logic of sacrifice, of finding someone to bear the burden of violence, isn't just limited to these ancient practices.
So he's saying these patterns are still present in our modern secular world, even if we don't have kings and ritual sacrifices anymore.
Exactly. Think about how we still have these figures who take on a symbolic role as scapegoats, celebrities, politicians, even entire groups of people. They become the focus of our anxieties, our fears, our need to blame someone for whatever's going wrong.
You're right. It's like we can't escape this need to find a target, someone to take the fall, even if it's just in the court of public opinion.
And Girard would argue that this is why violence keeps recurring throughout history. We haven't really moved beyond the scapegoat mechanism. We've just found more sophisticated ways to disguise it.
Okay, so if we're all still playing this ancient game, how do we even begin to change the rules?
Well, for Girard, awareness is the first step. By understanding these mechanisms, by bringing them into the light of consciousness, we have a chance to break free from their grip.
So knowledge is power, in a sense. The more we understand about these patterns of violence, the better equipped we are to resist them.
That's the hope. But Girard's work is also a warning. It reminds us that violence is incredibly adaptable. It can morph and disguise itself, finding new ways to express itself, even in societies that claim to have rejected it.
That's a pretty sobering thought. But we can't just end on that note. What are some of the positive implications of Girard's work? What can we learn from it, besides just feeling doomed to repeat the same cycles of violence?
One of the most hopeful aspects of Girard's theory is that it offers a new way to understand human desire. This is where his concept of mimetic desire comes in.
Right. We touched on this earlier, the idea that we often want things simply because other people want them.
Exactly. And Girard argues that this mimetic desire is at the heart of much of the conflict and violence in the world. We get caught up in these rivalries, these competitions for scarce resources or social status, because we're constantly imitating each other's desires.
So instead of just blaming our own individual greed or aggression, we need to look at the social dynamics that are shaping our desires in the first place.
That's a key point. And Girard suggests that by becoming aware of this mimetic process, by learning to discern between our authentic desires and those that are imposed on us by others, we can break free from this cycle of rivalry and conflict.
So it's like we need to develop a kind of immune system against these contagious desires to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, do I really want this, or am I just caught up in the hype?
Exactly. And Girard believes that this kind of critical self-reflection is essential for creating a more peaceful and just world. It's not about eliminating desire altogether, but about understanding how it works and learning to channel it in more constructive ways.
That's a powerful message. So it's not just about understanding the past, but about using this knowledge to create a better future. But how do we actually do that? How do we apply these ideas to our own lives?
Well, one practical implication of Girard's work is that it encourages us to be more mindful of our own desires and the desires of others, to ask ourselves,
Where's this desire coming from? Is it truly mine, or am I just imitating someone else? And what are the consequences of pursuing this desire, both for myself and for others?
those are great questions to reflect on. And Girard's work also encourages us to be more critical of the systems and structures that shape our desires, to question the values and assumptions that drive consumerism, competition, and the endless pursuit of status and recognition.
So it's about taking a step back and asking, is this really the kind of world I want to live in? And if not, what can I do to change it?
Exactly. And Girard's work provides a framework for understanding the deep-seated mechanisms of violence that often operate beneath the surface of these systems.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from ancient sacrifices to modern consumerism, from the scapegoat mechanism to mimetic desire. Where do we go from here? What are some of the things our listeners should be thinking about as we wrap up this deep dive?
I think one of the most important takeaways from Girard's work is that violence is not just a physical act, but a cultural and psychological phenomenon that permeates all aspects of human experience.
It's like an invisible force that shapes our relationships, our institutions, even our own desires. And it's something we need to be constantly aware of, constantly working to resist.
Exactly. And Girard's work reminds us that this is not a battle we can win alone. It requires collective effort, a willingness to confront our own complicity in the cycles of violence, and a commitment to creating a world where those cycles can finally be broken.
That's a powerful call to action. And it brings us back to where we started with this idea that violence is at the heart of human society. But that doesn't mean we're doomed to be its victims. We have a choice.
And that choice begins with awareness. By understanding the mechanisms of violence, by recognizing the patterns that have played out throughout history, we can start to imagine a different future, a future where violence is no longer the defining feature of human experience.
This has been an incredible journey exploring the depths of René Girard's Violence and the Sacred. It's a book that challenges us to see the world and ourselves in a new light and to grapple with some of the most fundamental questions about human nature and the nature of society. So much of what we've been talking about feels heavy, like this weight of history and these patterns we can't escape.
Mhm.
But Girard also talks about festivals and celebration. How does that fit in with all this talk about violence and scapegoats?
That's where it gets really interesting. Girard argues that festivals are actually a way of ritualistically reliving the sacrificial crisis. It's like a controlled dose of chaos, a way to safely experience the threat of violence without letting it spiral out of control.
So it's not just about letting off steam. There's a deeper psychological and social function going on.
Exactly. Girard believes that the fear of violence, the memory of that potential for chaos, is what drives these celebrations, even if it's buried beneath layers of tradition and merrymaking.
Does he give any specific examples of how this plays out in different cultures?
He talks about the Swazi Inkwala, an annual kingship ritual with dances, mock battles, and a symbolic sacrifice. It's like society is acting out these ancient anxieties and desires, purging themselves through ritualized violence and coming out the other side renewed.
Wow, that's a powerful image. So even in celebration, there's this shadow of violence lurking beneath the surface.
That's one of the things that makes Girard's work so thought-provoking. He forces us to see the connections between things we often think of as opposites, violence and peace order and chaos, the sacred and the profane.
And he does this by looking at myths and rituals from all over the world, right? We talked to Oedipus earlier, but he also analyzes the myth of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and ecstasy.
Dionysus is fascinating because he represents this dangerous allure of undifferentiation, of the breakdown of boundaries and social norms. His followers, the Bacchae, are known for their ecstatic frenzy, which Girard sees as a kind of social breakdown, a threat to the established order.
So it's like Dionysus represents the potential for violence to erupt from within society itself, to overturn the structures that keep everything in check.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is that Girard shows how both Dionysus and Pentheus the king, who tries to resist him, embody aspects of both order and violence. They're two sides of the same coin.
It's like even the figure who's trying to maintain control can't escape the pull of chaos, can't help but become a mirror of the very force he's trying to suppress.
That's a great insight. And it leads us to another theme that Girard explores, the concept of twins doubles and the monstrous.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How do twins fit into all of this?
Girard sees twins as embodying this primal fear of undifferentiation, of the loss of distinctions between individuals.
Because they're literally identical. They represent a blurring of identities.
Exactly. And he connects this to the idea of the double in mythology and literature. He uses a Tsimshian myth as an example where two rival cousins end up mirroring each other's violent acts, their identities merging in this cycle of aggression and revenge.
So it's not just about twins, literally, but about this psychological idea of doubling, of losing yourself in the other, especially in the context of violence. Which brings us to the monstrous, right?
Yes, Girard sees monsters as embodying the same anxiety about the breakdown of distinctions. They represent the chaos that threatens when the boundaries between self and other human and animal order and disorder are blurred. They're the embodiment of our deepest fears.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense. It's like Girard is showing us how these seemingly disparate elements, myths, rituals, social anxieties, figures like kings and monsters, are all woven together by this underlying threat of violence and the need to control it.
That's a great way to sum it up, and I think it brings us full circle to the core of Girard's work, the scapegoat mechanism. It's this ancient primal pattern that we see playing out in different forms throughout history and across cultures. And while we may have developed more sophisticated ways of managing violence, the underlying logic of scapegoating, of finding someone to blame, might still be at work in our own societies.
This deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking, but I have to admit it's also left me feeling a bit unsettled. If Girard is right, and these patterns of violence are so deeply ingrained in human nature, is there any hope for us?
That's the challenge Girard leaves us with. He doesn't offer any easy answers, but his work suggests that by understanding these mechanisms, by becoming aware of how they operate in our lives and societies, we have a chance to break free from them.
So it's not about denying the darkness, but about facing it head on, about seeing it clearly so we can start to imagine a different path.
Exactly. And I think that's the ultimate value of reading Violence and the Sacred. It doesn't give us all the answers, but it prompts us to ask the right questions about ourselves, about our societies, about the nature of violence, and the possibility of peace.
Well, listeners, there you have it. Our deep dive into René Girard's Violence and the Sacred. It's a book that will stay with you long after you finish reading it, prompting you to see the world and yourself in a whole new light. And if you're ready for more challenging but insightful explorations, be sure to join us next time for another episode of Books and Bytes.